Good evening and welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. So our guest this week is researcher from the Royal College of Art in London, Miriam Phelan. Miriam's research looks at the themes of crisis, commemoration and dress during the revolutionary period in Ireland. Miriam, I can't wait for this. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be on, and such a lovely series of stories that you've been doing. So it's lovely to be a part of it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's definitely ended up being an unexpected highlight of the past 12 months for me as well. So Miriam, I have so many questions, so I'm going to just jump in and ask you a pretty meaty question to start with, just to kind of get an understanding of your where your research is coming from. When I was reading some of your work, a phrase that I came across a few times was this idea of the embodiment of memory through dress. What on earth does that mean?
Well, it's a good place to start. I suppose the best way of explaining it is that my primary resource, my first port of call when I'm doing research is dress, so objects. And it could be objects in museums, it could be costumes from a particular production, but objects, the actual material themselves, so clothes, uniforms, jackets, trousers, these things are where my research starts. And when we think about the clothes that we wear ourselves, we've got sort of ripped cuffs and we wear out the elbows and there's stains and signs of wear. So I'm thinking about how I can read these objects and what those signs of wear can tell me about the person who wore them and the time in which they wore them. So the creases, the stains, the life that a body gives to clothes is really where I start with my research. So if you think about the embodiment of memory, it's these signs of life that are given to clothes through wearing it on the body. And I use these objects then as my starting point to ask questions about, well, who wore them? When did they wear them? Why did they wear them? What was their life like? It might be that they were a laborer and so wore their clothes and patched them, and or it might have been that they were very precious, very expensive clothes, so they were hardly ever worn and had very little wear on them. So these are memory traces that we leave behind in our bodies. So that's what I mean by the embodiment of memory. It's how these objects that we leave behind attest to the body that wore them, if that makes sense.
It does. Oh, absolutely. It's what a fascinating and kind of interesting area of research to get into. It's curiosity has it, like, how did you get into, like, how did you land on this as a research subject? Is it?
Well, I mean, I was as surprised as anyone, but I suppose I have always been interested in clothes. My great grandmother was a seamstress and a dressmaker, and my mum taught me how to sew. And then I did fashion design in NCAD. So it's always been in my blood. I've always been interested in clothes. And I thought that I wanted to work in fashion and that I wanted to make clothes for a living. But I realized that I had bigger questions about what do clothes mean, for how our own identity, for how we see ourselves, but also how we relate to each other and how we understand and interpret other people. So I realized that I wasn't getting the answers to those questions that I wanted from working in fashion, although I still like to sew and I still like to work with clothes. But I find that doing this kind of research and I get hands-on with these beautiful historic garments, it gives me the same joy. And so that's, I suppose, where I started with clothes, with dress, and it sort of it snowballed very quickly from there.
What a wonderful direction it's headed in. And so the research period that your research focuses on is obviously the revolutionary period, and we're obviously going through a period of kind of commemorations in present tense of the 100-year anniversaries. I guess just to kind of contextualize our conversation this evening, you might just kind of recap the key milestones in that period of Irish history?
Yeah, so I started my PhD in 2017, so it was sort of in the midst of this decade of centenaries. So we're Ireland is obviously commemorating from the 1913 strike and lockout all the way through to the end of the Civil War. So we're in the midst of this period. There's also globally lots of commemorations going on. The First World War, the Russian Revolution, all of these things were happening around the same time. And I started thinking, as these milestones came forward, obviously I started my PhD after the centenary of the 1916 Rising, but I started asking questions about what these milestones meant for how we understood our own history, for how we related to history. There was so much in popular culture, but also the state was very involved in, say, the 1916 Rising commemorations. It was everywhere. And so I wanted to understand more what the impact that those commemorations had, if anything, on how we understood our own history. So I suppose there were the big milestones like the strike and lockout, but then other ones that I didn't realize even from my own, history in primary and secondary school. Were so important, like 1915 and the funeral of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, and even other commemorations like the work of Roger Casement. All of these different stories, so the big stories and the little stories were coming forward, and I just found it raised a lot of questions about how history comes about and how we think about history.
I do think it is something that we talk about in the Little Museum, this idea of how history is, how stories are recorded and protected for future generations is really, it's fascinating because kind of different perspectives will always record events differently. And I kind of wonder if it must have been something that you faced in your research.
Yeah, and as a design historian, like I said, my sort of starting point is generally museums and museum collections. So I think about what the museums have, what kinds of clothing they have, and what stories can be told from that. But then also what's missing, what clothes and dress might be missing. So I might go to even the National Museum in Dublin and look at a uniform and think about who wore the uniform, what their experience of the war was.
I guess one thing that we were really interested about back in 1916, and as you mentioned a moment ago, there was a huge amount of activity that happened in remembering the Rising. And I remember a conversation that happened in great detail within the museum sector was this idea of, are we commemorating? Are we remembering? Are we celebrating? What is going on here? I wonder how your research faced the same question.
I think for me, it was very important to think about 2016 in context to how the country has commemorated it, the 1916 Rising before. So I looked very closely at 1966, 1976, 2006, all of these other milestones to understand how, with sort of a retrospect, how I can look back and think, how were the economic, social, and political contexts changing how the commemorations were shaped. So in 1966, at the 50th anniversary, they were very celebratory. They were very focused on the survivors, so those who had actually fought in the Rising. So there was a very different tone, say, to 1976, where really very little happened because of the context of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The narrative started to change and was engaged with in a very different way. Again, if we look at 2006 versus 2016, and even the sort of approach in 2016, there was an idea or a feeling of sort of bringing forward voices that hadn't been brought forward before. So making sure that there was a real effort to include women's histories and even queer histories, that there was all of a sudden a new idea that, okay, how can we use this national commemoration to amplify other voices that maybe haven't been amplified before?
Okay, and then it's funny because I think with the scale of the events that we had in 2016, that kind of sets a precedent for milestones that followed thereafter. And I kind of curiosity on my own part from your research, like looking at this year, like what did we anticipate it was going to be like in 21 versus what's probably going to be the reality as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to think about commemoration in the context of the pandemic that we're in at the moment, especially when I look back and think about 2018 and the commemoration of the Spanish flu, which obviously was 1918 to 1920, and how that really wasn't commemorated in the same way that the First World War was commemorated. And also from a material culture perspective, to think about what materials were collected, what materials are collected, and there's very little. Even in the National Museum, there's very little in terms of material culture that attests to the experiences of people during the War of Independence and certainly the Civil War. The material culture just isn't there. And so there, I suppose, I'm thinking about what other ways can these stories be told of these people? Is it through, say, reenactment, living history, to reimagine people's stories and experiences through different ways? And I think that there is a lot of potential there, but it's important to acknowledge, why doesn't the material culture survive? Why do we not have objects that bear witness to these experiences? And it's got a lot to do with how we remember and how we relate to our history. And that's from my perspective as a material culture historian. And there's lots of other ways of engaging with that, like living history and reenactment, which is a very interesting branch of history as well.
And when you say that there's maybe not as much kind of as many pieces still in existence as kind of ideally there would be, why do you think that is?
There's a very interesting disconnect between, say, what we choose to remember and what is difficult to remember. The 1916 Rising was collected very much at the time because it was, particularly after the execution of the leaders, there was a sense that this was something important, that this is something important that should be remembered. So people were collecting all sorts of things, bits of, broken rubble from outside the GPO, but equally uniforms, the caps, guns, all of these things were collected at the time. And yet when something more traumatic, say like a civil war, is happening, where it's much harder to think about who it is we're fighting against, because this is a national issue. And it's much harder to collect those stories. People find it much harder and want to move on from something, rather than looking back and thinking, well, do I really want to keep this object that reminds me of this very difficult period? It only entrenched, further divisions in families, and so it was a difficult history to remember. But there are efforts being made, I think, to recover these stories, and that's in part maybe what I'm trying to do, is think about, well, how do we write history, and how are these things remembered, and how can we uncover and bring forward voices that haven't been recorded elsewhere? So that's sort of a part of it's also a part of my research in thinking about the revolution, but also how the revolution's commemorated 100 years later.
And you kind of alluded to it there, the fact that you are looking at performance, you're looking at museums, theatre practitioners, digital media. Like, is there one or two standout pieces that have occurred in recent years that have kind of been either vital to your research or personally you've just been really taken with?
Yeah, I mean, I have a whole chapter that looks at commemoration and performance in Ireland. There's lots of amazing examples, but particularly the ones that stand out to me are the work of Anu,
Mm,
who have been doing throughout all of the centenary and the decade of centenaries, these amazing immersive performances, which in a different way bring history to an audience by immersing them in the history, which is this amazing experience. And I've been to a few of these performances myself, so I can, you know, that there's a sort of a visceral engagement with history. And obviously I'm looking at these immersive performances by looking at costume and how those costumes juxtapose the actor and the audience, but then also how the actor pulls the audience into the performance by literally engaging them. They did in 2013, there was Anu did a performance called Living the Lockout, which was in Henrietta Street before it became the Tenement Museum. And it was just the amazing bones of the building and these few bodies telling the story again of a people whose stories aren't necessarily recorded elsewhere. These were the very, very poor of Dublin who had nothing literally except the clothes on their backs.
mm,
And so these actors were tasked with telling this story literally through their words and the costume that they had. And it was an amazing way of telling this sort of forgotten story and giving voice to these people who
mm,
didn't have, you know, there's no memoirs, there's no objects, they don't have shirts and trousers that survive in the National Museum because, well, they would have worn until they were absolutely worn out and couldn't afford to be kept.
mm,
So that was one definitely that stood out to me as a new engagement with this kind of history.
mm.
And then another one that also stood out for me was a dance piece called The Casement Project, an amazing project by choreographer Fergus O'Crahor, who choreographed this beautiful series of pieces. Part of it was on Bannistrand, where Casement landed before he was arrested in 1916. And the dance interpreted Casement's life as a humanitarian and his work in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then also his work for the revolution, but then also his public and private life, his sort of private life as a homosexual, and how that related to his public life, and the sort of how that all came to the fore in a very dramatic way after he was arrested. And I thought that the use of dancers' bodies, both men and women, was a really interesting way of telling his story. Again, this idea of an embodiment of memory. And it wasn't necessarily that there was somebody dressed up like Roger Casement on Bannistrand. It was a much more intimate and sort of, you know, 100 years later, an interpretation of what the implications of Roger Casement's life are for us, you know, understanding our history.
Mm.
So those are sort of the few that stand out. And I do think performance is an amazing way of reassessing and reinterpreting history, particularly if you're thinking about costumes and bodies and how we can retell an old story.
Yeah, and I absolutely, I think the work that you're describing there from Manu and that performance piece sounds beautiful. But it's fascinating when we can look at I guess the complexity of the human rather than simply, you know, the one sentence historical figure as they're recorded sometimes. And I kind of was curious about something that you said there about, you know, the reality is for a lot of um, marginalized or poorer voices that you know, there's not going to be large collections in the national museums because, you know, for exactly the reasons you outlined. And I kind of wonder, like, through your research, have you been able to actually find out much about the lived experience of, you know, the everyday folk or the marginalized people living through the period?
In terms of a sort of, you know, like a golden ticket, I haven't found some sort of long lost diary that was written by somebody who lived in a tenement. I mean, that's the dream, obviously. But what I have learned, because my research sort of covers, it's very interdisciplinary, so I cover lots of different areas. I look at theatre and performance, I look at museums and museum collections, but I also look at living history. And although I can't recover the lost voices, what I can do is ask questions about how we choose to engage with that history now. So people want to find out, which I think is a really, you know, nice thing, that people now want to hear from these people and reimagine what these people might have felt. I did a series of interviews with questionnaires with reenactors who, there isn't a huge culture of reenactment in Ireland, but there is, particularly for this period. But there are, you know, these groups who are very dedicated to reenacting this period. And it was very interesting to get their take on why they chose to engage, you know, as a reenactor in this period, and what they wanted. And I was fascinated to hear how they really wanted to get into the mindset of these people and really feel what it felt like to be, you know, living in Ireland in the 1920s or the 1910s. And that for me is another way of recovering voices and an experience of history in the present. You know, there is no way really of recovering those lost voices, whether it's, you know, women's voices, you know, which have been, you know, were maybe amplified at the time but have since been silenced, or queer voices which were never given the space within the story of revolutionary Ireland. But there is a desire now and a push to have a real connection with these people. And I think that I'm seeing that certainly now at the centenary, and there's a drive to engage with this lived experience, and I do hope it continues, that people continue to push the boundaries of the sort of the very established histories we have of revolution in Ireland.
That's no, thank you. I see someone has just written in a question here that I'm going to borrow. I'm quite curious to hear your answer. This is a question from Miriam. Oh, sorry, a question to ask Miriam. Apologies. So I'd be curious to know your answer kind of in the broad scheme of your research generally. And they're wondering if you have a favorite piece that you have worked on. And I guess to kind of make that quite general in terms of, as directly with the museum or research in terms of the story that it's uncovered, is there something that's particularly special to you?
A particular item of clothing or an object? Well, one of the things that I really loved, and I came across this really early in my research, was a collection of dress that actually belonged to Roger Casement. And it was a pajama suit. So a very simple set of pajamas that could have been worn at any point. And, you know, they weren't particularly exciting or related to any particular event. But for me, the pajamas were such an intimate object. They're obviously not on display. I was lucky enough to be able to go you know, backstage and have a look at these objects up close, which is just such an immense privilege. But they were these linen Irish pajamas, so they were made in Ireland, and they just struck me as such a hugely intimate object. You know, there's something that nobody ever sees you in pajamas, and they sit so close to the skin. You know, you wear them when you're most vulnerable, and I just felt like they were such a poignant object, particularly in the whole story of Roger Casement's life and his, you know, his arrest and trial, and how public it all was. To see this very intimate object really gave me a sense of how important it is to look at clothes, and even the ones that aren't particularly exciting. And you know, Roger Casement traveled all around the world, but he had these Irish linen pajamas, and so this sort of like very intimate idea of his connection to Ireland, a very intimate connection to how he identified and in his private life and his private voice. And I don't know, would they ever be suitable or appropriate to be put on display, but I just felt them surviving was this very sort of poignant moment. And that's always what I love when I'm looking at clothes, is to sort of peek behind the curtain of these big overarching stories that tend to focus on the dramatic points, when actually it's those really intimate moments which are a real reflection of history. So that's probably, and that's a really lovely question.
It is, and it's the person who wrote in mentioned that their favourite is Michael Collins's coat up in Collins Barracks.
Also an amazing star object, yeah.
Very much so. And it kind of, you were talking there about the relationship between the piece of clothing, between the garment and the body. And, you know, I think for a country that is known for our way with words, from our politicians through to our writers, this must be, I kind of get the impression this is an idea that you're talking about a lot throughout your research.
Yeah, I think the body in Ireland has possibly been a slightly neglected topic, or maybe something taken for granted slightly. And the body has been subject to so much censorship. And you know, not just in Ireland, obviously, the body has been censored and you know, shaped. And even when you think about war, what the body goes through for war, it's, you know, it's drilled and shaped and wounded. And but in Ireland, I suppose, you know, I'm constantly seeking to try and find the body in these stories, and where it's mentioned and where it's pictured and where it's described. But I think that the body is a really interesting way into difficult histories as well. So there was obviously a wealth of literary sources. I mean, so many of the revolutionary leaders were also great poets and writers. But if we look instead at the body, it's this point of universal experience. So we all have a body and understand what that feels like. It's different for everybody, but it, you know, wearing clothes, having a body is a universal human experience. So it's often a very good place to start thinking about difficult histories, because it starts with a universal human experience. And that's why I think positioning the body in asking and dress, but to ask these difficult questions and to look at difficult and often traumatic histories opens up a whole new window, which I think is quite interesting and has huge potential in other areas, I think.
But I think that idea of looking back into our history and taking, I guess, kind of discovery and thoughts from it, like different historical figures and different people throughout our history have kind of, I guess, have approached the events that they were living through in different ways. Like I'm thinking of the example that you had mentioned to me in a conversation previously that I'd love you to talk about a little bit more. This idea that, you know, Pearse was someone who maybe we could think structured the narratives that he was living and creating simultaneously.
I think anybody who is involved in a movement, is seeking to start a movement, even in the back of their minds is thinking about how will this be understood in 5 years, 10 years, 100 years time? How can I position myself and the rhetoric of my movement in a way that it's going to have resonance throughout history, not just for now? And I think I'm thinking about Jeremiah O'Donovan Ross's funeral, and how Pearse positioned himself and his own body alongside, you know, he talks about all of the graves of these Fenian dead. You know, he was so aware of positioning himself within this broader history of revolution. And I do feel that there, you know, obviously he couldn't have known what would happen afterwards, but there is an awareness of, okay, how do I position myself and my body to ensure that this has resonance beyond the now? And I mean, it does, you know, in 2015, that speech that Pearse did was reenacted at the grave of O'Donovan Rossa. And, you know, this daily reenactment ensures that this particular point in history, you know, remains part of the whole story. and you know, often is considered by many historians as a starting point, certainly for the 1916 Rising. So I do think that any politician, any military leader who is engaged in starting a movement has an awareness of the visibility of their body and what that's going to mean for the future. And that's, you know, I have gotten such an insight into that just from this research and looking at these specific instances throughout history.
And I think it's just really, it's fascinating, the breadth and the scale of your research. Like, it is, there's so many different aspects to it. I'm totally in awe of it all. But it's kind of, one thing I keep thinking of in the back of my mind while you're talking is this whole idea that, you know, in the little museum, a thing we spend a huge amount of time thinking about and talking about, this idea of civic pride in the kind of the present day tense. And, you know, I'm really curious what you think about how us learning about our shared history actually influences how we see ourselves, or how we see others, or how we see our society today.
Yeah, I think an understanding and an awareness of the fact that we're constantly changing our relationship with our past. It's not the same as it was, you know, 15, 20 years ago. And it changes in relation to our present. So like living through a pandemic, now all of a sudden, well, I certainly find myself thinking about those people in 1918 and 1920 and how much actually we had in common with them and how did they cope compared to how we're coping. And I think it's really important to keep pushing and asking those questions. Well, what relevance, if any, does this history have to how we understand ourselves now? I also think it's very important to contextualize our history, the history of the revolution, much more broadly, in terms of what was happening globally. You know, the First World War was happening at the same time as the 1916 Rising, and how did those things change then? How has the story been changed since then? And what does that mean for how we understand it now? So I think context, considering the broader context of our history, is very important. And you know, this drive to include other voices in our history, to acknowledge the fact that maybe certain bodies have been excluded or omitted. And, you know, it's that sort of self-reflective doing or engaging with history that I think is very important. And it's always at the forefront of my mind. Obviously, as a historian, you always have to reflect on my own position. You know, how do I see myself? You know, I'm doing a PhD in Irish revolutionary history in London. I mean, what does that mean? How does that change my understanding of Irish history? And it hugely does, because you get a whole different set of perspectives looking from, you know, from London, even a whole different set of sources. You know, if I'm looking in the National Archives in Kew in London versus the National Archives in Dublin, what kind of sources, what kind of histories am I getting? And equally, collections in the Imperial War Museum will tell a very different history than to the collections in the National Museum. But how can I bring those histories together to tell something that's more cohesive and that's more inclusive of all these multiple voices? And that's sort of the job of the historian, is to constantly question, why am I looking at these sources? Why am I asking these questions? And what does it say about me, my understanding of history? And so that's always going on in the background. So I'm not just doing history of the revolution, I'm also writing a history of how it's being remembered. So it's this kind of dual thing that's happening all the time.
That's really, I think, that idea that you have to kind of personally reflect on the geographical place in which you're doing your own research and how that actually informs it and what the context there is. And I'd love you to kind of talk a little bit about the Royal College where you are researching, because one thing, I think it's an incredible model of best practice that I kind of think it would be fascinating to see if it could be applied here. But your research is being done between the college and the V&A, is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm doing my PhD on the History of Design program. And the History of Design program is based between the Royal College of Art and the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it's this sort of positioning of the Royal College and the museum that enables researchers to use objects in material culture. So I have access to the collections at the V&A for my own research. Obviously, it doesn't relate directly to what I'm doing now, but say I did my master's on the same History of Design program, and all of my resources were there in the museum. So I had this amazing opportunity to research objects, to get hands-on with objects, which is obviously the absolute dream. And again, a real privilege. But it sort of gave me an education into the value of working with objects as primary source material and the kinds of questions you can ask with them. And so that's where that pairing of the Royal College and the V&A comes from. And it's also just a really interesting place to do research, because I am working alongside sculptors and painters and photographers and curators, and so there's a real and I suppose that's why my research is so interdisciplinary, because I'm surrounded by all of these different disciplines who are approaching their research from all these different perspectives, which certainly keeps you on your toes and is a very intensely creative environment. It's great. And I think were I to do it anywhere else, maybe it would be a very different project.
But it sounds like a very inspiring kind of enthusing environment to work in. It's fascinating to hear about. I do think it's such a wonderful structure by the sounds of it. And you touched on your master's program there a moment ago, and I understand, if I'm remembering it correctly, your master's was on masculinity in conflict, but looking at it from both the Irish and the British perspective. I guess, kind of without going too deeply into it, like, what were or were there kind of a few very clear commonalities or differences that were identified through your research?
Like all research, I suppose I threw up more questions than I did answers, and hence why I ended up doing a PhD. But it was sort of, so much of the preliminary work for my PhD happened in my MA. Really, I identified the main collections that I was going to work from. But when you start with a research question, the more you dig, it gets more complicated, and the story becomes muddied, but in a good way. It becomes complicated, but for in a positive way, in that you just have more questions to answer. And I wanted to find out what men were wearing during the war. I found that all of the secondary literature for England and Ireland only talked about the war period, so 1914 to 1918. They were all talking about military uniform, as if all men stopped wearing clothes and only wore uniform during this time. And I was like, well, that's obviously not true. What are these men wearing? Where were they getting their clothes? What was the impact on their sense of their own masculine identity, their national identity? And so I found that men were wearing clothes. They weren't all wearing uniform. But that it had a huge impact on how they related to the sense of national identity, because so much of the rhetoric around recruitment and winning the war was about getting into your khaki uniform. And that was the same in Ireland as it was, across England. And I found that really interesting. And even just the act of trying to recover these stories of civilian men in Ireland during the First World War, and what they were wearing and how that made them feel. And it certainly, threw up more questions than answers, but that's sort of where it led into my PhD research. And I just think there's huge potential in that, to ask more questions. I've gone down one avenue, but there's a whole sort of other set of questions that you could ask of that period, particularly in Ireland.
Yeah, and like, I think one subject, or one kind of reality of dealing with what is a challenging kind of violent period of history that does face death, that does have differing opinions, different perspectives. Like, how do you think we generally have, be it museums, performance, us in our own personal private capacities, like how do you think we've approached this need to have hard conversations in order to actually honestly reflect on our shared history?
Gosh, that's a complicated question.
That's a very mean question, will I?
No, it's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that I'm still thinking about. I'm still grappling with that. But I think actually, the Ireland's heritage in theatre has proven to be very interesting, because theatre has, from my research, proven to be a platform where difficult histories are dealt with, maybe where they aren't elsewhere. So if you think about Sean O'Casey and The Plough and the Stars in Juno and The Paycock and The Shadow of the Gunman, those plays were really quite shocking at the time, because they were, first of all, they were positioning the ordinary laboring classes on the stage to tell their experiences of the revolution, where other platforms weren't. And I have found that again, with Anu, or the theater and performance, this sort of live engagement with history has engages with difficult histories in a more forthright way, maybe, than other more traditional institutions like a museum, like state ceremonials and parades and those kinds of things. Even when I was speaking with reenactors, there's a sort of a very careful consideration for what roles they're going to undertake and what that means for the experience that they're going to have. Are they going to reenact an RIC officer, or is it going to be, an Irish volunteer? So there is still, those questions are still very, prevalent to people in Ireland today, and they are still difficult histories, absolutely. But I have found that performance seems to be this way into approaching them, and I feel like that's part of our heritage of theatre in Ireland. It's so ingrained in who we are, performance, playwrights. It's sort of, it's in our blood. And I think, yeah, that's been an interesting thing that I've sort of found out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I apologize for giving a slightly challenging question, but
no, I loved it. That's great.
you responded very beautifully and eloquently. But I guess I'd love to move on to kind of ask you a little bit about some of the curation work that you've done. Like a subject that we actually have been spending a bit of time on in the museum during this current lockdown is the history of the Jewish community in Ireland. And I know that you actually were involved in curating an exhibition in the Jewish Museum of London. So I'd love to hear about that as an experience, because the Jewish Museum is kind of a house museum on kind of a comparable scale to ourselves, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so the Jewish Museum in London, it was a great opportunity to engage with a whole other set of stories and histories that I had no knowledge of. And I was working as an assistant curator on a menswear exhibition there, actually, which was just after my master's, and it was this whole other perspective on menswear, which I just didn't have. And it's an amazing place to engage with a history that you might not have experienced elsewhere. It's a very unusual museum in that it has obviously the sort of religious galleries that has all of these beautiful artifacts that are, sort of ceremonial ritual objects, but then also a hugely important sort of social history gallery that deals with obviously the Second World War and all of the atrocities committed around then, but also just sort of Jewish life in London, which was an incredible opportunity to engage with that material, and also the community, which is very involved in the museum and the stories that the museum tells. So that was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, as a design historian, and I'm sure you relate to this as well, I like to tell stories through objects, and it doesn't really, when I'm presented with a sort of maybe an object that I don't know where it's come from, or it's a whole area of history I don't know, I love to be able to, okay, well, I've got this now. How can I tell its story, or how can I position it in a broader story to enrich it? So that's sort of what I really love to do. And that was such an amazing opportunity working in the Jewish Museum in London. And, you know, people were so engaged with this history. We'd so often get people coming to the museum who'd be like, I've never been here before. I've lived in London for 45 years and never thought to come here, and they had, you know, had an amazing experience. So I think smaller niche museums are a wonderful way of sort of opening people's eyes to the potential of material culture.
And I think 100% absolutely. And I think one of the experiences I cherish in the museum, in our museum when we're open in normal times, is like that. It's meeting someone you've never met before and may never meet again, and having a conversation and finding a connection or learning something about their life or their history, which is prompted by a piece within our collection. And I guess because that must be, because, you know, having experience working in somewhere like the V&A, which is, you know, it's such a large beast of a museum. It's a spectacular place, but the scale is amazing. But that in comparison to a house museum, kind of the Jewish museum, it must have been really quite interesting as a researcher and kind of from a material culture perspective, dealing with such different types of collections.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it makes you question sort of the value of objects. Like obviously a beautiful 17th century men's waistcoat, you know, it's hard not to just fall to pieces because it's so beautiful. But it has just as interesting a story to tell as, you know, a sort of a handmade menorah or something. You know, that you start to question the hierarchy of objects, and why some things might have been collected and deemed important and others weren't, and yet they're just as valuable to sort of piecing together, you know, a particular history. I obviously, the collections at the V&A are just amazing, but I think that there is an awareness now in the V&A of making sure that they don't just tell the stories of sort of beautiful objects and good design, that they tell a story of life and everyday interaction with design. Which is a huge part of their exhibition program now, and it is a really interesting one. They have a sort of a rapid response collection, which I know you also do in the little museum. That it's like, what's the experience of Dubliners now, and what kind of material culture do they engage with, and how can we make sure that that's collected? And I, you know, again, I think there's a lot of sort of remedial thinking around who's been left out of this history, who have we omitted, and how can we invite them back in.
And I think it is that openness to have very honest conversations about what voices are being represented, and perhaps, you know, what communities need to be given more of a platform or just brought into the conversation, as you said. And then I know you did a piece of work with the Charles Dickens Museum, and I can imagine that must have been spectacular.
Yeah, that's an amazing museum as well. It's also a historic house museum, and a whole other collection of objects, which has obviously a completely different story to tell. And I was doing some research for them on Charles Dickens's Dress, and an exhibition that has sort of opened just after the pandemic, or just before sort of lockdown. But it was just this amazing exhibition thinking about trying to look at Charles Dickens in a different way. Obviously a very famous character who we all know very well, but it was about seeing him in a new light. And I had the opportunity to research his dress, and there was a waistcoat that came forward that nobody knew existed, and it came forward and it was in the exhibition, which was amazing, you know, to sort of get hands on. And I mean, I say hands on, I mean with gloves on, obviously. Didn't touch it with my bare hands. But with these, you know, amazing objects, and how all of a sudden we could see a new aspect of Charles Dickens that nobody had seen before. So even these, you know, very well-known figures are more complicated than we think that they are, and have a different story to tell. There's always a new angle, and no matter how well you think that you know a particular period of history, there's always a new way in. And we were just lucky enough that this waistcoat sort of came forward. It had just been in a belonged to a private collector, and it came forward, and it was a very plain, ordinary day-to-day waistcoat, and I just thought that was a great insight into the fact that he obviously wore ordinary clothes sometimes as well. So that was amazing.
I guess between that and the linen pajamas earlier,
Yeah.
kind of it's the private self, and that's like they're the moments that really are that bit more precious, because it's who are you when no one can see you.
Exactly. Yeah.
And actually, then I must ask, it's Dickens, as you said, it's a man and a name that we know so well. Tell us something about the gent that we didn't know to begin with.
Well, one of the things that I loved was reading letters, because he was really famous when he was alive, and I loved reading people's reactions to him when they met him. And so many people just found him so like garishly dressed, and so many people hated it. They were like, oh, this wonderful author Charles Dickens, and then I met him and he had so many diamond rings on, and his his chest was adorned with gold and jewels, and so many people found it really off-putting that he was in no way fashionable but completely eccentric, wearing green velvet waistcoats with a long blue wool coat, and the absolute horror that with which so many people received him, I found really enjoyable.
That's a beautiful story. Okay, that's paints a picture as to the character, I must say.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I guess just kind of before we run out of time, I might just see if we've had a few questions come through. We've got Jane has asked, where is the most unusual place that a piece that had ended up in your research has come from?
Wow. That's a very interesting question. I don't know if I have a direct answer, but I have found that when you talk to people who aren't necessarily in a museum or collectors, that when you start talking to them, I've had conversations with people, reenactors, costume designers, and it's the little bits of incidental information that they will give you, sort of like, oh yes, well, even speaking to reenactors who will be talking to me because they think I'm only interested in how they engage with it. And then they'll say, well, actually, also I have family members that, died in the 1916 Rising or the First World War. And although maybe that's not sort of an object or a piece, a piece of material culture, it is a piece of information that I find really interesting as to why they became motivated. And they won't often maybe be forthright with that information because they think it's not relevant to what I'm asking them. But I find that really interesting, that it's like, okay, so this is a bigger thing than just wanting to reenact a particular maneuver during the War of Independence. This is something that, is in the in your blood, it's in your history. So those little bits of information that come out when you're talking to people, even having conversations like this, people will, oh yes, well, I had somebody who was in the Somme or something, and these bits of information come out from the most unlikely of conversations, which I always love. I always love when people share their stories.
Yeah, I think that is one of the true privileges of, I guess, running a museum, and by the sounds of it, working a career in research, that it really, you just have the privilege of people being so open and honest and vulnerable about their own personal stories, because you do see how your artifacts and stories directly relate to their lives and our wider shared experience.
Absolutely.
I'm mindful to we have a few people here saying that they've attended some of Anu's productions previously as well, and agree that they are beyond spectacular. And then I see a question here, kind of asking, we see historical photographs, and the rebels are usually in their uniforms, and they're wondering if we might be maybe a little bit afraid to show our heroes in normal clothes.
Yeah, that's so interesting, actually. That's such an interesting observation, because we have such a clear idea in our head of what a military hero should look like.
Mm.
And what are the implications if they're wearing civilian clothes? What does that mean? You know, I mean, what are their words associated with conflict? Talk about people in civilian clothes. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, you know, films, stories, you know, people want their heroes to be dressed in uniforms and leading the charge, but so often that's not the case, particularly in Ireland during this period. So many of the men couldn't afford to have proper uniforms. Generally, the photographs that we see are those men who were fortunate enough to scrape together, you know, bits of a uniform, but the ordinary man wouldn't have had enough money to have a uniform made for him, and certainly have a full suit of uniform. He might have had a jacket and wear his own trousers. But you know, you find that the images that are circulated generally are those of the men who look slightly more uniform, but that was not the standard by any means. And I think it was important as well for men themselves taking part in something to feel a uniform was becoming part of something, a unified cause. But we don't necessarily have photographs of those.
And I think this this idea of being part of something bigger, I think we all realize, especially over the last year, that it is such a human key part of human existence and part of our kind of natural condition. And it's like, Miriam, this has been really, truly fascinating. I could happily have sat here for the next hour and continue asking you questions. I see questions are continuing to come in, but yeah, I think, Miriam, you've been so generous with your time and with your knowledge. And so I just really want to say sincerely, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here this evening.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me. It's always such a pleasure to have the space and opportunity to talk about my research, but also, you know, you've been so sort of engaged, and you've asked such interesting questions, and people brought such interesting questions forward. So thank you so much.
No, very happily. And to everyone joining us this evening, really sincerely thank you all so much for being here. I do see people commenting that again, Miriam, they found it fascinating. So thank you. So this is it for another week of 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. Just to mention that we are doing 2 wine tastings with the wine writer John Wilson on the 18th of February and the 4th of March. So if any of you would like to attend that, the guys over in Santa Rita are actually arranging the wines to be delivered via Bodega 695. So if anyone wants to book their tickets for that, please do get them in. But otherwise, I will see you next week when we'll be joined by Councillor Mary Freehill. So for now, Miriam, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.